A woman discovers her husband lost her in a poker game, bet her like she was nothing more than a sack of gold. But she doesn't find out from him. She finds out 3 months later after his funeral from a stranger covered in bear blood who paid $3,000 to own her debt. He didn't want her love. He didn't want her gratitude. He looked her in the eye and said 5 words that would haunt the entire Montana territory. Your body is mine until I have my sons. She had no money, no home, no family. Winter was coming, and the only door open to her led straight into the arms of a man the town called the Beast of Bannock. But here's what nobody expected. Not the beast, not the banker, not the entire town watching from behind their curtains. This woman didn't break. She didn't beg. She negotiated. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the most dangerous weapon in the Wild West wasn't a gun. It was a woman who knew how to read a contract. This story will remind you that your worst moment is not your final chapter, and that real strength isn't about fighting back with fists. It's about standing up with your mind when the whole world expects you to kneel. At its core, this is a story about choosing to stay, not out of fear, but out of courage. It's about 2 broken people who learn that trust isn't built through promises. It's built through honesty, even when the truth is ugly. And it's proof that the door to your freedom was never locked by someone else. It was always waiting for you to walk through it. If this story gave you chills, drop a comment and tell me, would you have turned left toward Helena or right toward the mountain? Hit that like button if you believe paper can be stronger than gunpowder. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to rewrite your contract with life. And if you don't want to miss stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one. Clarabelle McCrae discovered that her husband had sold her for a pair of aces. But it took 3 months, a funeral, and a man who smelled of bear blood before she learned the price. They called it the darkest bargain ever struck in the Montana Territory. It was not written in a bank ledger, and it was not signed with ink. It was signed in desperation on a freezing night in 1883, when a destitute widow facing the gallows of poverty looked into the eyes of a feral mountain recluse known only as the Bear of Bannock. She thought she was saving her life, but she did not know the price. He did not want her money. He did not want her love. He leaned in close, his voice like grinding gravel, and gave her an ultimatum that would haunt the West. Your body is mine until I have my sons. This is the true twisted tale of the Beast of Bannock and the widow who tamed him. Bannock, Montana Territory, November the 14th, 1883. The wind did not blow across the Beaverhead Valley that morning. It screamed. It tore through the slat-board walls of the mining town, carrying the promise of a winter so harsh it would snap frozen pine trees clean in half. But the cold was not the cruelest thing Clarabelle McCrae faced that day. Not by a long mile. She stood in the cemetery at the edge of town, alone, staring down at a mound of frozen earth no bigger than a supper table. A cheap wooden cross marked the grave. No stone. Stone cost money. And Patrick McCrae had left none. He had not left much of anything except a leaking roof, a locket with a broken clasp, and a mountain of gambling debts his widow had not known existed until the funeral dirt was settled. Clarabelle did not cry. She had spent 3 weeks' worth of tears already. What she felt now was something colder and heavier than grief. It was the slow, dawning understanding that sorrow was a luxury she simply could not afford. She was 24 years old, though the last month had aged her a full decade. Her red hair, the wild copper fire she had inherited from her father back in Dublin, whipped across her face in the bitter wind. Her dress was patched at the elbows and thin as paper. Her boots leaked. Her stomach was empty, but her spine was iron. She touched the wooden cross with bare fingers that had gone numb an hour ago. You could have told me, Patrick. You could have trusted me with the ugly parts. The wind took her words and scattered them across the frozen hills. Nobody answered. Nobody ever would. She allowed herself one more breath of the icy air, one more look at the pitiful grave. And then she turned her back on Patrick McCrae for the last time and walked toward the Beaverhead County Bank. Because grief did not pay debts. And debts, she had learned, did not wait for the grieving. The office of Phineas Graves smelled of stale cigar smoke and impending ruin. Graves himself sat behind a desk of polished mahogany that was worth more than every building on the south end of Main Street combined. He was 52 years old. He wore a silk vest the color of oxblood and an oiled mustache that curled at the tips like the horns of a ram. He looked like a vulture dressed for Sunday service, but what made him dangerous was not his appearance. It was his patience. "Please sit, Mrs. McCrae." He gestured to the stiff wooden chair across from him with a hand so clean it had clearly never touched a shovel or a pick or an honest day's work. Clarabelle sat on the edge of the chair and gripped her reticule until her knuckles went white. She kept her chin high. She had learned from her father, a blacksmith who had hammered iron in Dublin until his hands were hard as the metal itself, that you never let a man see you tremble, even when you were trembling on the inside like a leaf in a storm. Graves poured her a cup of tea from a china pot. He slid it across the desk with practiced sympathy. He called her Mrs. McCrae in a voice that dripped with manufactured concern. He explained the debt as though he were delivering unfortunate weather news. "Patrick borrowed $2,000 against the deed to your cabin and the acreage. He defaulted. The bank holds the note. I'm afraid it is a simple matter of arithmetic." Clarabelle wrapped her fingers around the warm teacup but did not drink. "Patrick was a good man who made poor choices," Graves continued. "We all understand. Times are hard in the territory. The mines pay less and less every season." Then he leaned forward, and the mask of sympathy slipped just enough for Clarabelle to see the predator underneath. "I own the boarding house adjacent to the Gem Saloon. There is a position available, room and board included. You would be serving tables, of course." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Clarabelle had lived in mining towns long enough to know exactly what serving tables meant after dark. She had seen the girls at the Gem. She had watched them drift through the swinging doors with painted faces and dead eyes, and she had told herself, "That will never be me." She had believed it because she had Patrick. And now Patrick was in the ground and the wolf was sitting across from her in a silk vest offering her tea. She looked at Graves. She looked at his clean nails, his patient smile, the way he folded his hands and waited. And she understood with a cold, sickening clarity that this man had done this before. She was not the first widow to sit in this chair. The tea, the sympathy, the gentle offer. It was a machine, oiled and efficient, and she was just the latest piece of raw material to be fed into it. She set the teacup down. She stood. Her voice did not tremble. "I would rather freeze in the snow, Mr. Graves." Graves was not angry. He was not offended. He was amused. That was the worst part. He smiled the way a man smiles when a fish wriggles on the hook, knowing it is only a matter of time. "I admire your spirit, Mrs. McCrae, but spirit does not burn in a stove." He returned to his ledger without looking up. "You have until noon tomorrow." Clarabelle turned toward the door. Her hand was on the brass knob when she heard it. Graves was speaking to someone in the back room, his voice low but not low enough. She caught only a fragment through the half-open door. "She will come around. Let her think she has no choice." Clarabelle's blood turned to ice in her veins. He had planned this. He was not reacting to her desperation. He was counting on it. He had orchestrated the whole wretched performance from the tea to the sympathy to the gentle suggestion. And he was sitting back there right now telling someone, probably one of his men, that the widow would fold like a bad hand of poker. She stepped through the door and into the blizzard. The wind hit her like a slap. Snow drove into her eyes and her mouth and her lungs. She bent her head against it and walked, though she had nowhere to walk to. The cabin would be taken by noon tomorrow. She had $11 in her purse. That would buy a stage ticket to Helena, maybe. But then what? A strange city. No family. No skills that anyone would pay for except the ones Graves was so eager to exploit. She was so deep in her own dark thoughts that she did not notice the man. He stood in the lee of the livery stable across the street, half hidden by the shadow of the overhang and the swirling snow. He was enormous, 6'4" if he was an inch. He wore a coat made from the hide of a grizzly bear, the claws still attached at the collar like some savage decoration from another century. His beard was a thicket of black and gray that hid half his face. But his eyes were visible, pale, icy blue, the color of glacier meltwater, and they were fixed on Clarabelle McCrae with an intensity that would have frightened her if she had seen it. But she did not see it. She walked right past him, spine straight, chin high, eyes blazing with a fury that had nowhere to go. And the man in the grizzly coat felt something fracture behind his ribs, a sensation he had believed was dead. Because Clarabelle McCrae walked the way Eliza had walked, not the same woman, different face, different fire, but the same refusal to kneel. His name was Colton Ridge. The people of Bannock whispered it like a curse. He lived on the darkly named Dead Man's Peak, a place so treacherous even the Shoshone had abandoned it generations ago. Rumor said he had killed 3 men in a duel in Wyoming and fled to the mountains to hide from God and the law. Rumor said he ate raw meat and spoke to bears and had not touched a woman in a decade. Some of the rumors were true, some were not. But none of them mattered at this particular moment because Colton Ridge was not thinking about rumors. He was thinking about the red-haired woman who had just walked out of that bank with her dignity intact and no place to sleep tonight. And he was thinking about the man sitting inside that bank. Phineas Graves, the 4th man, the last name on a list that Colton had been carrying in his coat pocket for 10 years, written in pencil on a scrap of paper stained with old blood. 3 names had been crossed off that list. Graves was the last. Colton had spent 3 years building toward this moment. 3 years of watching and waiting and planning. He knew Graves and his operation. The predatory loans, the foreclosures, the widows funneled into the saloon. He knew because Graves had run the same operation in Wyoming a decade ago, and that operation had killed Colton's wife and daughter. But Colton had not planned for what was happening inside his chest right now. He had not planned for the way his heart hammered when Clarabelle McCrae looked at the sky and squared her shoulders like a soldier marching into a battle she knew she could not win. He had not planned for the memory that surged up unbidden, Eliza's face in firelight, baby Rosie laughing in a tin wash tub, the smell of bread baking in a cast-iron stove, and then the smoke, the screaming, the charred timbers of a homestead. Colton crushed the memory, shoved it down into the dark place where he kept all the things that would destroy him if he let them out. Not now. Not yet. He adjusted the heavy leather pouch of gold dust inside his coat and walked toward the bank. Colton Ridge stepped through the door of the Beaverhead County Bank with $3,000 in raw gold and a plan 10 years in the making. He knew exactly what he was doing. He did not know that the red-haired woman shivering in the street outside was about to dismantle every piece of it. Colton Ridge did not use the word that the coarser men of the territory might have used. He did not say broodmare, he said, "I need an heir." But Clarabelle heard what he did not say. She heard the desperation of a man who had lost everything and was terrified of losing whatever came next. Inside the bank, the transaction was swift and brutal in its simplicity. Colton walked to Graves' desk, his heavy boots leaving muddy tracks on the expensive rug, and dropped a leather pouch onto the mahogany surface. The sound echoed like a gunshot. 3,000 in raw gold, Colton said. His voice was a low rumble, the kind of sound that vibrated in your chest like distant thunder. The widow's debt, paid in full with interest. The balance buys the land outright. Graves opened the pouch. He weighed the dust on his brass scale. He examined the quality. And here was the thing that planted a splinter in Clarabelle's mind, a splinter she would not be able to extract for months. Graves did not look surprised. He did not ask who Colton was. He did not question why a mountain recluse was paying a dead miner's debt. He simply weighed the gold, signed the deed release, and smiled. Pleasure doing business, Mr. Ridge. Colton took the deed release. He folded it carefully and walked out of the bank without another word. Clarabelle was still standing in the street, half frozen, trying to decide which direction to walk when a direction no longer mattered. Colton approached her. He did not look at her face. He held out the folded paper. "The debt is paid. You are free." Clarabelle stared at the paper, then at the enormous man holding it. She waited for the conditions, the terms, the catch. There was always a catch. In her experience, men did not hand women pieces of paper without wanting something in return. But Colton simply stood there, arm extended, snow collecting on his massive shoulders like a dusting of white ash. She took the paper, opened it, read the words that confirmed the Beaverhead County Bank no longer held any claim against the McCrae property. Her hands were shaking, and it was not entirely from the cold. Colton turned to walk away. "Wait," Clarabelle said. He stopped, but did not turn. "Why?" she demanded. "A stranger does not pay $3,000 in gold without reasons. I want to hear them. I have my reasons." "That is not an answer. I am not a charity case, and I do not accept gifts from men I do not know. Whatever you want from me, say it now so I can tell you no and be done with it." Colton turned. He studied her. Not her body, not her face, her eyes. He saw the defiance in them, the intelligence, the grief she was trying to bury under anger, and he made a decision he had not planned to make. "I live on the mountain, alone. I have land and gold, but no heir. I am 36 years old. Up there, that is old. I need a child to carry what I have built." He paused. "You need shelter through the winter." "I am offering an arrangement." Clarabelle's jaw tightened. "What kind of arrangement?" "A practical one. Come to the mountain, live under my roof. If, after 1 year, you agree, we will have children. 2, after that, you receive the deed to your house free and clear, plus $500 cash. If after 1 year you do not agree, you keep the house anyway. I lose nothing but time." Clarabelle let the words settle. 1 year. He was giving her a year to decide. He was not demanding her body tonight or tomorrow or next week. He was offering a trial, a partnership with a deadline and an exit. It was still madness, but it was not the madness she had expected. "And if I give you daughters instead of sons?" she asked, testing him. Colton went quiet, longer than she expected. His right hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket, touching something inside. When he spoke again, his voice caught strangely on the word, as though he were swallowing a piece of broken glass. "Then I will have daughters." Clarabelle filed that moment away, the hand on the pocket, the catch in his voice. There was a story buried in that pause, and she intended to find it. But not today. Today she needed to survive. She looked at the blizzard. She looked at the bank. She looked at the mountain man. 1 year, she said, and I sleep alone until I say otherwise. Colton nodded once. "Agreed. Then I will come with you, Mr. Ridge. But understand something. I am not your property. I am not your servant. I am a woman making a choice between bad options. The moment I have a better one, I will take it. Fair enough." They did not shake hands. Clarabelle climbed onto the buckboard wagon that Colton had hitched outside the livery stable, and they rode out of Bannock in silence while the town watched from behind curtained windows. The widow and the beast. The gossip would burn hotter than any stove in Beaverhead County. The journey to Dead Man's Peak was a vertical nightmare. The wagon wheels crunched over ice and loose stone. The trail was not really a trail at all, but a goat path masquerading as a road, switchbacking up the face of the mountain, through stands of snow, heavy pine, and across ledges where the drop on one side was 1,000 feet of nothing. For the first 2 hours, neither of them spoke. The air grew thinner, colder. Clarabelle's wool coat was no match for the altitude, and by the time they had climbed above the tree line, she was shivering so hard her teeth were clicking together like castanets. Colton noticed. Without a word, he reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy buffalo robe. He draped it over her shoulders. "I did not ask for that," Clarabelle said. "You did not have to." Silence again. Then, midway up a particularly brutal stretch of switchbacks, Colton halted the wagon. He climbed down and crouched beside the trail, examining something in the snow. Clarabelle leaned over to look. Tracks. Massive, deep, 5-clawed. "Old Scar," Colton said. He spoke the name the way some men spoke the name of a neighbor they had known for 20 years. "This bear has been on this mountain longer than I have. He does not attack if you stay out of his territory." He paused, and something that might have been humor flickered in those icy eyes. "Same rules apply to me." It was the closest thing to a joke Clarabelle had heard from him. She did not laugh, but something in her chest loosened. Just slightly. They reached the cabin as the last light bled out of the sky. The structure was not a cabin so much as a fortress. Massive logs notched together backed right up against a cliff face to shield it from avalanches. A stone chimney smoked into the starlit darkness. The door was heavy oak bound with iron. Inside, the cabin was warm. A fire roared in a stone hearth big enough to roast a whole deer. The floor was swept clean. Furs covered every surface. Bear, elk, wolf. It was savage, but it was shelter, and after 5 hours in the freezing wind, shelter was worth more than gold. But Clarabelle noticed things that did not fit a bachelor's cabin. A small rocking chair pushed into a corner, sized for a woman, not a man. Nail holes in the log walls where curtains had once hung. A windowsill worn smooth, as though someone had spent years sitting there watching the valley below. There were traces of another life in this place. A woman's life. And that woman was gone. Clarabelle saw these things. She did not ask about them, not yet. "There is only one bed," she observed. Colton pointed to it. A massive frame of rough-hewn logs piled high with buffalo robes. "You sleep there. I take the floor. That is the rule until you say otherwise." He did not elaborate. He did not posture or explain himself further. He bolted the door, banked the fire, and lay down on a pile of furs with his back to her. Clarabelle changed into her nightclothes behind a screen made of stretched elk hide, climbed into the enormous bed, and pulled the heavy covers up to her chin. She lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside and the steady, deep breathing of the stranger on the floor. After an hour, she realized something. He was not sleeping. His breathing was too even, too controlled. He was awake. All night. He was standing watch. Over what she did not know. Over her. Over the mountain. Over whatever ghosts lived in this cabin alongside the furs and the firelight. Clarabelle woke at dawn. Colton was gone. The fire was freshly stoked and burning strong. A pot of coffee steamed on the table beside a plate of cold venison and a biscuit that was dense as a river stone but edible. On the small rocking chair in the corner, the one that had clearly belonged to someone else, sat a folded wool blanket that had not been there the night before. He had fetched it for her sometime in the dark without waking her. Clarabelle picked up the blanket and felt something beneath it. She reached down and her fingers closed around a small cloth doll, hand-stitched, made for a child. Her blood turned to ice water. She held the doll up to the gray morning light filtering through the window. It was carefully made, lovingly made. The kind of thing a mother or a father would sew for a little girl. Clarabelle set the doll back where she found it, exactly as it had been. She pulled her hand away as though the cloth had burned her. There were questions a woman trapped on a mountaintop with a man like Colton Ridge should not ask, at least not yet. The snow did not stop for 6 weeks. It piled against the cabin walls until the windows were buried in white drifts, turning the interior into a permanent twilight. Time on Dead Man's Peak ceased to be measured in hours and minutes. It was measured in wood logs burned and silence endured. December bled into January. The world shrank to the size of 4 walls, a stone hearth, and 2 people who circled each other like wolves sharing a territory neither was willing to surrender. Colton Ridge was a man of rigid, almost military routine. He rose before dawn. He stoked the fire. He checked the perimeter for wolf tracks and cougar sign. He spent his days repairing traps, cleaning his weapons, and curing hides. He spoke only when necessary, and his version of necessary was a far sight narrower than most people's. Water, he would say, setting the buckets by the door. Wood, he would grunt, pointing to the pile that needed splitting. Beyond those single-word commands, the cabin was a monastery of silence. But Clarabelle McCrae was not the delicate flower Phineas Graves had assumed her to be. She was a McCrae by marriage, but an Irish blacksmith's daughter by blood, and she knew the value of work the way she knew the value of breathing. Her mother had been a midwife and herbalist in County Cork, a woman who could deliver a breech baby at midnight and have a pot of nettle tea brewing by dawn. Clarabelle had inherited those hands and that knowledge, and she was not about to let either go to waste on a mountaintop. She did not weep in a corner. She took over the cabin. It started with the cooking. Clarabelle discovered within the first week that Colton ate the way a wolf ate. Irregularly, ravenously, and without any attention to what the food actually was. She found him gnawing on a strip of dried elk jerky at noon one day, and realized he had not eaten anything else since the previous evening. His back seized up every cold morning. A war wound she recognized by the way he moved. Stiff, favoring his left side, his jaw clenched against a pain he refused to acknowledge. She began preparing bone broth, not out of wifely duty, out of knowledge. Her mother had made the same broth for the dock workers in Cork who came in bent and broken from loading ships. Willow bark for the swelling, marrow for the strength. She simmered it over the fire in the big iron kettle and set a bowl on the table where Colton would find it. "I do not need tending," he said, looking at the bowl as though it might contain poison. Clarabelle did not argue. She did not plead. She did not smile sweetly and tell him it was for his own good. She simply set the bowl down and walked away. "It is there. Eat or do not. Your choice." She busied herself mending a tear in one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. She did not look up. She did not watch to see if he ate. She gave him the dignity of choosing without an audience. He ate the broth. He did not mention it. But the next morning, his empty bowl sat by the fire, and a fresh-caught rabbit lay on the table, skinned and cleaned and ready for the pot. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about it. This was how they began to speak. Not in words, but in objects. A bowl of broth left on a table. A rabbit left in return. A pair of mended socks placed on his chair. A stack of kindling split into pieces small enough for her to carry. They built a language of small acts, and each act said the same thing. "I see you. I see what you need. I will not make you ask." But the silence, despite its growing warmth, had teeth. One night in late December, a blizzard hit the mountain with a fury that made the previous week's storms seem like spring showers. The wind did not just howl, it shrieked. The cabin shutters banged so violently that Clarabelle jerked awake with her heart slamming against her ribs like a fist. She lay still, breathing hard, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting a dim orange glow across the floor. And there, on the pile of furs beside the hearth, Colton Ridge was thrashing. He was drenched in sweat. He was drenched in... His massive body twisted and jerked as though he were fighting an invisible enemy. His hands clawed at the furs, his teeth were bared. And from his throat came sounds that Clarabelle had never heard from a grown man. Whimpers, broken fragments of words, names she did not recognize. Orders barked in a voice that belonged to a different time. "Fall back. Hold the line. God Almighty, hold the line." Then, cutting through the battlefield gibberish like a knife through cloth, one word, one name, spoken not in the voice of a soldier, but in the voice of a man whose heart was being torn from his chest. "Eliza. Eliza. Run." Clarabelle lay perfectly still. She did not know who Eliza was, but she understood. with a sudden and devastating clarity that the man on the floor was not merely solitary. He was haunted. Whatever had driven Colton Ridge to the top of this God-forsaken mountain, it was not a love of solitude. It was a terror of memory. She wanted to go to him. She wanted to shake him awake and tell him he was safe, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that a man like Colton would be humiliated to know she had witnessed his vulnerability. Perhaps it was simply the instinct, bred into her by years on the frontier, that you do not put your hand near a thrashing animal, no matter how much you want to help. So she lay still, pretending to sleep, and listened to his nightmares until they passed, and his breathing slowed and the fire cracked and popped in the quiet. She did not sleep again that night. The next day she asked Colton no questions about Eliza. She did not mention the nightmares. She simply went about her work, scrubbing the pine floor until it shone, organizing the erratic piles of dried meat into something resembling a pantry, airing out the furs that had begun to smell of smoke and sweat. She worked the way her father had worked at the forge, steadily, without complaint, without pause. Colton watched her. She could feel his eyes on her back as she moved through the cabin, and she knew he was trying to figure her out the way he might try to figure out an unfamiliar animal track in the snow. She was not afraid of him, and that unsettled him more than fear would have. He was accustomed to people being afraid. He was not accustomed to a woman who looked him dead in the eye and told him his boots were on the wrong feet. Which she did on a Tuesday, when he stumbled to the door at dawn with his left boot on his right foot and his right boot on his left. He looked down, he looked at her. She raised one eyebrow and went back to her coffee. He sat down and switched the boots without a word. It was the closest either of them had come to laughing. The confrontation that had been building for weeks finally erupted in late December. Colton returned from checking his trap line with a brace of snowshoe hares and tossed them onto the table. Blood dripped onto the wood that Clarabelle had spent an hour scrubbing that morning. Something inside her snapped, not violently, quietly, like a rope that has been fraying for weeks and finally gives way under one last pound of pressure. I just cleaned that. Colton paused, unbuttoning his heavy coat. He looked at the blood, then at her. His eyes were tired, rimmed with red from the biting wind. It is a skinning table. It is a dining table, and we are not animals. You may live like a bear, Colton Ridge, but I do not. The air in the cabin changed, charged, like the moment before lightning when you can feel the hair on your arms stand on end. But Clarabelle did not retreat. She was done retreating. She had retreated from Patrick's lies. She had retreated from Graves's machinations. She had retreated all the way up a mountain and into a stranger's cabin, and she was finished. She walked toward Colton, not away, toward. You do not have to like me, but if we are sharing this cabin for a year, you will not treat me as though I do not exist. I have a name. Use it. Colton stared at her. No one had spoken to him like this in 8 years. She could see the shock of it ripple through him like a stone dropped into still water. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, like a man remembering a word in a language he had not spoken in a decade, he said her name. Clarabelle. Nothing else. Just her name. But from that night forward, something changed. He began to speak. Not fluently, not easily. In fits and starts, the way a frozen creek begins to thaw. Short sentences, observations about the weather or the trap line or the behavior of the wolves on the North Ridge. She answered in kind, matching his brevity, never pushing for more than he could give. One morning, a few days after the confrontation, Clarabelle found something beside her breakfast plate, a small sprig of dried mountain laurel. Its petals were brown and curled, but it was unmistakably a flower. Colton was outside chopping wood. He did not mention it. She did not mention it. She tucked it into the pages of her father's Bible and felt something shift in her chest. Not love. Not yet. But the recognition that there was a human being buried under all that granite. A human being who had thought to pick a flower for her and leave it without a word, because words were the hardest thing he had. That night, for the first time since she had come to Dead Man's Peak, Colton did not lie rigid on the floor, pretending to sleep. He slept, truly slept, and the nightmares did not come. He did not know why. He did not know that Clarabelle had stayed awake until his breathing deepened, whispering the only lullaby she remembered from County Cork, so quietly that the words were lost in the crackle of the fire. But something in him heard, and something in him rested. Colton did not tell Clarabelle about Eliza until the night the mountain tried to kill him. And when he did, she wished he had not. February, 1884. The snow was deeper than it had been in 20 years. Colton left at dawn to check the far trap line, a 2-day journey along the ridge line where the terrain was steep and the snow was treacherous. Clarabelle watched him go from the cabin door, his massive figure disappearing into the white like a ghost being swallowed by a cloud. He did not return the first night. She expected that. He did not return the second morning. She expected that too. But when the second afternoon came and went, and the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the temperature dropped so fast she could feel the cabin walls contracting around her, Clarabelle began to pace. She was standing at the window, staring into the white nothing when she saw him. Or rather, she saw something that might have been him. A dark shape moving through the snow at the edge of the tree line, stumbling, falling, getting up, stumbling again, moving with the desperate lurching gait of an animal that knows it is dying and is trying to reach shelter before its legs give out. Clarabelle threw on her coat and ran. She found Colton 50 yards from the cabin. He was gray-faced and trembling. His left shoulder hung at a wrong angle. His clothes were soaked through. He had been caught in a small avalanche on the ridge. The slide had buried him to the waist. He had clawed himself free with his bare hands, dislocating his shoulder in the process, and then walked 4 miles through waist-deep snow in a temperature that would kill a healthy man in 2 hours. He was not a healthy man. He was hypothermic. His lips were blue. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. He looked at Clarabelle and said a word that was not her name. Eliza? Something in Clarabelle's chest clenched like a fist, but she did not hesitate. She got under his good arm and took as much of his weight as she could bear, which was not much considering he outweighed her by 120 pounds, and she hauled him toward the cabin, one agonizing step at a time. Inside, she stripped his wet clothes with hands that shook from cold and urgency. She wrapped him in every blanket and fur she could find. She forced ginger tea down his throat, a recipe her mother had sworn by for cases of severe chill. She packed heated stones from the hearth around his body. She worked with the calm, efficient intensity of a woman who had watched her mother save lives in the worst conditions County Cork could produce. Colton was delirious. He muttered and thrashed. He called out names she did not know. He fought invisible enemies. He issued orders to men who were probably dead. And then again, that name, that word that seemed to cost him more than any other. Eliza. Where is Eliza? She is still in the house. Clarabelle pressed a cold rag to his burning forehead and whispered, I am here. You are safe. The door opened behind her and a blast of cold air swept in. Clarabelle spun, reaching for the rifle on the mantel, but it was not an intruder. It was a woman. Short, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by decades of mountain wind and sun. She wore snowshoes lashed to her feet and carried a leather bag over her shoulder. Her dark hair was shot through with silver and pulled back in a single braid. Nolly, Clarabelle breathed. She had never met the woman, but Colton had mentioned her once, briefly. The Shoshone healer who lived in the high meadows to the east. Nolly did not waste time with introductions. She crossed to Colton, knelt beside him, and examined his shoulder with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. She produced a poultice from her bag, something that smelled of sage and pine pitch, and another herb Clarabelle could not identify, and packed it against the swollen joint. Hold him down, Nolly said. This will hurt. Clarabelle braced Colton's good shoulder. Nolly gripped his arm, counted to 3 in her own language, and wrenched the shoulder back into its socket. Colton screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed off the log walls, and then went limp, unconscious. The pain had taken him under. Nolly sat back on her heels. She looked at Clarabelle for the first time. Really looked. She took Clarabelle's hands and turned them over, examining the calluses, the old burn scars from cooking fires, the capable fingers. Your mother was a healer, midwife, County Cork. Nolly nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. They worked together over Colton's body in silence for several minutes, Nolly applying poultices while Clarabelle bandaged. When they were finished, Nolly stood and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove as though she had been in this cabin 1,000 times, which perhaps she had. Last time he brought a woman to meet me was 10 years ago, Nolly said. Colton stirred on the bed. Nolly, he warned, his voice weak as a kitten's mew. Nolly ignored him. She looked at Clarabelle over the rim of the coffee cup. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, completely without sentimentality. He thinks he is the hunter, Nolly said, but sometimes the bear is hunted without knowing it. Clarabelle did not understand the warning, not yet, but she filed it away alongside the doll, the rocking chair, the name Eliza, and the way Colton's hand always drifted to his coat pocket when he thought no one was watching. Nolly left the next morning before dawn. Clarabelle found a bundle of herbs by the door with instructions scratched in charcoal on a piece of bark. Willow for pain, yarrow for swelling, comfrey for the shoulder. Apply twice daily. 2 days passed. Colton recovered enough to sit up and eat solid food, though his shoulder was strapped tight and his face was still the color of old snow. The air in the cabin was heavy with everything that had not been said. Clarabelle could feel the weight of it pressing down on both of them like the 6 feet of snow pressing on the roof. She decided to go first. If she wanted truth from him, she would have to offer truth of her own. That was how trust worked. Someone had to bleed. One evening, sitting by the fire with a cup of bitter coffee warming her hands, Clarabelle spoke. Not about the deal. Not about the cabin or the winter or the traps. About Patrick. He was charming, she said, staring into the flames. Everyone loved Patrick McCrae. He could walk into any room and make every person in it feel like they were the only soul alive. She paused. But he changed after we came to Bannock. The mines paid less and less. He started disappearing. Coming home at dawn with whiskey on his breath and lies on his lips. I smelled the gambling halls on his coat. I found iOS in his pockets. She took a breath. I knew, and I said nothing. I knew, and I. Because if I said something, I would have had to do something. And doing something meant admitting that the man I loved was destroying us. So I chose blindness. Her voice cracked on the last word. She gripped her coffee cup until her knuckles went white. I was not brave, Colton. I was a coward. And my cowardice is the reason I am sitting in your cabin right now, instead of in my own home with a husband who was still alive. The fire popped. Wind moaned against the shutters. Colton sat in his chair with his injured arm in a sling and his eyes fixed on the flames. She could see the war inside him. The door she had opened with her confession was pulling at something behind his ribs, and he was fighting it the way a man fights a flooded river. Then the river won. I had a wife, he said. The words came out rough, rusted, like machinery that had not been used in years. Her name was Eliza. Clarabelle did not move, did not breathe. And a daughter, Rosie, the doll, the rocking chair, the windowsill worn smooth by years of sitting and watching. Everything clicked into place with the quiet, terrible precision of a revolver's cylinder rotating into firing position. We were in Wyoming, Colton continued. We had a homestead, good land, creek water, enough grass to run cattle. Someone wanted that land, a speculator. He hired men to drive us off. We would not go, so they came at night. He paused. I was not home. I was in town buying supplies. I saw the fire from 3 miles away. By the time I got there, the house was gone. Eliza was gone. Rosie was gone. He stopped. He did not need to say more. The silence said it for him. Clarabelle felt tears sliding down her face, but she did not wipe them. She let them fall. "The people who wanted your land," she said carefully. "Did you find them?" Colton stared into the fire. "I found them. 4 men. 3 are dead." The air changed. Clarabelle felt it on her skin like the charge before lightning. "And the 4th? The 4th is sitting in the Beaverhead County Bank. Graves." The name fell out of Clarabelle's mouth like a stone dropping into a well. Colton nodded. And then the second blow came, the one she had not seen coming. "You knew about the poker game," she said. "It was not a question. You were there the night Patrick bet me." Colton did not flinch. His eyes never left the fire. "I was there. I saw it happen. I did not stop it. Why? Because I needed Graves to show his hand. I needed him to take the marker. I needed you in his grip, so I would have a reason to buy you out and tie myself to Bannock without Graves suspecting my real purpose." The room tilted under Clarabelle's feet. She gripped the arm of her chair. "You used me." Her voice was flat. "Dead. Like a field after a fire has passed through it. Just like Patrick. Different game, same table." Colton took the blow. He did not defend himself. He did not explain or justify or make excuses. He sat there and let her words land on him like fists. "Yes," he said, and then quieter. "But that was before. Before what? Before I knew you. Before you stood in this kitchen and told me to use your name. Before you read Eliza's letters without flinching. Before you were real." Clarabelle looked at him, and in his eyes she saw something she had never once seen in Patrick's. She saw merciless, unflinching honesty, the kind that does not spare itself, the kind that says, "I did this terrible thing, and I will not pretend I did not." It did not make what he had done forgivable, but it made him different from the last man who had gambled with her life. Clarabelle lay in the bed that night with her eyes wide open. She could leave. The snow was thinning. She could walk down the mountain. But if she left, Graves was still there. And if what Colton said was true, Graves would never let her be. She looked at the scarred back of the man on the floor, the man who had used her, the only man who had told her the truth. She hated him. She needed him. And she was beginning to understand that those two things might be the same. Clarabelle did not forgive Colton Ridge. She renegotiated. And this time, she set the terms. March of 1884. The thaw came violently. The sun returned and turned the snowdrifts into rushing rivers of slush. The mountain groaned as ice cracked apart, the sound echoing like cannon fire across the valley. Dead Man's Peak was waking up. And so was Clarabelle. She waited 3 days after Colton's confession before she spoke to him again. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She needed time to think, to weigh, to decide whether the man in front of her was worth the risk of staying, or whether she should take her deed and her $11 and walk down that mountain and never look back. On the morning of the 4th day, she set a cup of coffee in front of Colton and sat down across from him. He looked at her with those glacier eyes and waited. He had not spoken since the night of the confession. He had given her the silence she needed and asked nothing in return. "I have conditions," Clarabelle said. Colton set down his coffee. 1. No more secrets. If your plan against Graves touches me in any way, I have the right to know every detail before it happens. Not after. Before. He nodded. 2. I am not bait. I am not a pawn. If I am part of this, I am a partner. I make decisions. I have a voice. You do not move me around like a piece on a chessboard. He nodded again. 3. The matter of children. I decide when. Not you, not the calendar, not the contract. Me. Colton was quiet for a long moment. She could see him struggling. Not with the conditions themselves, but with the fact that someone was negotiating with him at all. He was a man accustomed to operating alone, making all his own decisions, answering to no one. Having another person at the table, demanding equal say, was foreign territory. But he was also a man who recognized rightness when he saw it. And Clarabelle was right. About all of it. Agreed, he said. Then we have a new deal, Mr. Ridge. She held out her hand. He looked at it. Then he took it. His hand was enormous, calloused, scarred across the knuckles. But his grip was careful, as though he were handling something fragile and did not want to break it. The cabin changed after that. Not in its physical dimensions, but in its atmosphere. The air cleared. The weight lifted. Two people who had been circling each other in suspicion began cautiously to collaborate. Colton taught Clarabelle to shoot. Not because he sensed danger coming, though danger was always present on the frontier, but because she demanded it. If I live on this mountain, I defend myself. I do not wait to be saved. He taught her the Winchester first, how to load it, how to aim, how to brace the stock against her shoulder so the kick did not knock her flat. She was a terrible shot for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, she put a bullet through a pine cone at 50 yards, and Colton looked at her with something that might have been respect. She taught him something in return. In the evenings, when the fire was banked and the wind had settled to a murmur, she read aloud. Not the Bible. Clarabelle found the Bible too easy, too expected. Instead, she read from a tin box she had discovered under the floorboards during her reorganization of the cabin. The box contained letters, dozens of them, written in a neat, careful hand on thin paper that had yellowed with age. They were Eliza's letters, written to her family back east, never mailed. The first time Clarabelle opened one and began to read, Colton went rigid. His hand tightened on the arm of his chair until the wood creaked. She watched him and waited for him to tell her to stop. He did not tell her to stop. She read. Eliza wrote about the homestead, about the creek that ran clear and cold past the kitchen window, about baby Rosie taking her first steps on a Tuesday morning and falling into a basket of clean laundry, about Colton building a rocking chair for the porch and getting the legs uneven so it wobbled something fierce, and Eliza laughing until tears ran down her face while Colton cursed and shaved the legs down one by one until it sat straight. She read these words aloud in the firelight, giving voice to a dead woman, and Colton listened. He did not interrupt. He did not weep. He sat perfectly still and let Eliza's words wash over him like water over stone. It was the most intimate thing Clarabelle had ever witnessed, more intimate than any touch. She was reading a dead woman's love to the man who had lost her, and he was letting her. That was trust. That was the kind of trust you cannot demand or negotiate. It can only be given. One passage stopped Clarabelle cold. She read it twice to be sure she had the words right. He is hard on the outside but breakable underneath. He is terrified of love because he is terrified of loss. If he ever does something foolish out of that fear, remember that fear is not the same as cruelty. Clarabelle looked up from the letter. Colton was staring at the fire. A muscle jumped in his jaw. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the tin box without comment. But she did not forget those words. She would need them later. The evenings grew longer and warmer. The snow retreated up the mountain, uncovering meadows of brown grass that would soon turn green. Clarabelle and Colton fell into a rhythm that felt less like a contract and more like a partnership. She cooked, he hunted, she mended, he chopped wood, she organized the cabin. He built shelves where she told him to build shelves, small negotiations, small surrenders, the domestic machinery of two people learning to share a life. But underneath the routine, something else was building, something neither of them named. One evening, sitting closer to each other by the fire than they had ever sat before, Colton spoke suddenly and without preamble. "If I touch you, I betray the woman I swore to love until I died." Clarabelle set down the shirt she was mending. She looked at him. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. He was not looking at her, but at some point in the middle distance where the past and the present collided. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you think Eliza wanted this for you?" A cabin, a mountain, silence, and a slow death. "It does not matter what she wanted. She is dead. And I am the reason." "You are not the reason," Clarabelle said, her voice steady. "The men who struck the match are the reason, and one of them is still breathing in a bank office 5 miles below us." Something shifted in Colton's eyes. She watched the guilt and the grief and the self-hatred rearrange themselves. She had not given him permission. She had not seduced him. She had done something far more dangerous. She had challenged a broken belief. She had taken the lie he had been telling himself for 10 years. "I deserve to suffer because I failed." And she had held it up to the light and shown him the cracks. That night, after Colton lay down on his pile of furs by the hearth, Clarabelle's voice came from the bed. "Come to bed." He did not move. "Clarabelle, you do not have to do this. I know I do not have to. I want to. There is a difference." He turned his head and looked at her in the firelight. She was sitting up in the bed, the buffalo robe pulled to her waist. Her red hair was loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were clear and certain. Colton rose from the floor. He crossed the room. He stood at the edge of the bed and looked down at her, and his hands were shaking. The hands that had killed 3 men. The hands that had skinned bears and built cabins and loaded rifles, shaking. She took one of those trembling hands and pressed it to her cheek. "I am here," she whispered, "and I am choosing this." He kissed her, not with violence, not with the brutish hunger she had feared during those first nights on the mountain. He kissed her with the desperate, starving tenderness of a man who had forgotten that gentleness existed and was remembering it one nerve ending at a time. He tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the cold, clean air of the mountain. When it was over, they lay tangled together under the buffalo robes, and Clarabelle listened to his heartbeat slow from a gallop to a walk. He was asleep within minutes, truly asleep. No nightmares, no thrashing. No calling out Eliza's name in the dark, just sleep. Clarabelle lay awake beside him and felt for the first time in years something that was not fear or grief or the hollow ache of loneliness. She felt the simple, terrifying warmth of being exactly where she was supposed to be. In the morning, flushed with new confidence and the lingering heat of the night, Clarabelle made a decision. She told Colton she wanted to go to town, to buy supplies, to gather information about Graves, to begin the work of bringing him down. Colton objected. "Too dangerous. Graves has eyes everywhere." "You said I am a partner," Clarabelle countered. "Partners do not hide on the mountain, while the world turns below." She saddled the mule and rode down the switchback trail with the Winchester across her saddle and a list of supplies in her pocket. She felt alive, capable, free. She did not see the rider on the ridge behind her. She did not see the brass telescope glinting in the afternoon sun. Dutch Halloway lowered the glass and turned his horse back toward Bannock. Graves would want to know that the dead woman was very much alive. The smell of gunpowder tastes like copper and salt. Clarabelle McCrae would never forget that taste. It would wake her at 3 in the morning for the rest of her life. Dutch Halloway received his orders in the back room of the Gem Saloon, where the lamplight was low and the whiskey was cheap, and the conversations were the kind that never happened. Graves sat behind a card table with a glass of brandy, his silk vest unbuttoned, his oiled mustache catching the light. He spoke the way he always spoke, calmly, precisely, as though he were discussing the weather or the price of grain. "The widow is alive. She is on Dead Man's Peak with Ridge. I want her brought back. And I want Ridge eliminated." Dutch leaned against the wall. He was 40 years old, lean as a rawhide whip, with a face like a skull scarred by smallpox. He was not a sadist. He did not enjoy killing. He was a professional who sold violence the way a blacksmith sold horseshoes, and he was very good at his trade. "Kill them both," Graves clarified, pouring another measure of brandy. Dutch was quiet for a moment. Then he said the words he always said when the job crossed his one remaining line. "I do not kill women." Graves looked at him. "Then bring her to me alive." Dutch felt the familiar twist of nausea in his gut. But Graves still owed him $300 from the last job, and a man in Dutch's line of work could not afford to be picky about clients. He nodded and left the saloon. He rode out at dawn with 2 hired guns. On Dead Man's Peak, Clarabelle returned from her trip to town to find the dogs barking. Not the playful bark of feeding time. The deep, guttural warning that meant something wrong was coming up the trail. Colton was already moving. He had spotted dust on the switchbacks an hour ago, 3 riders pushing hard up the mountain, and he had been preparing ever since. He did not stand in the middle of the yard like a hero in a dime novel. He was a Union Army veteran who had survived Shiloh and Chickamauga, and he knew the difference between courage and stupidity. He positioned himself behind the woodpile with the Winchester, using the stacked logs as a breastwork, with a clear field of fire covering the approach trail in the yard. "Inside," he ordered. "Now." Clarabelle ran for the cabin. She latched the heavy oak door and grabbed the Navy revolver from the mantel, the one Colton had taught her to load and fire during the long winter weeks. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window and peered through the shattered slats. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, Dutch Holloway in front, 2 hard-looking men behind him, rifles across their saddle bows. They fanned out as they entered the clearing, professional and alert. "That is close enough," Colton called from behind the woodpile. Dutch reined up. He looked at the woodpile, calculating angles and cover. He was impressed despite himself. Ridge had chosen his ground well. "Colton Ridge, you are a hard man to find. You found me. Now turn around and leave before I put you in the ground." "I'm afraid I cannot do that. Graves sent us. He wants the woman." "She is not here." Dutch smiled. Now, Ridge. We both know she is. Let us not make this harder than it needs to be." Colton did not respond. The silence stretched. Wind moaned through the pines. One of the horses shifted nervously, sensing the violence coiled in the air like a rattlesnake in tall grass. The hired gun on the left made the mistake. He was young, jumpy, and he brought his rifle up a half-second too soon. Colton fired first. The Winchester cracked, and the young gunman flew backward off his horse, a bullet through his hip. He hit the ground, screaming. The second gunman swung his shotgun toward the woodpile. Colton jacked another round and fired again, blowing the stock off the shotgun and sending the man tumbling into the dirt. Dutch drew his revolver. He had a clear shot at Colton's position. His thumb cocked the hammer. His finger found the trigger. And then Clarabelle opened the cabin door. She stood in the doorway with the Navy revolver raised, silhouetted against the dark interior of the cabin, and Dutch's finger froze on the trigger. A woman in his line of fire. He lowered the gun. That split second of hesitation was the opening Colton needed. But it was also the moment Clarabelle's mistake became real. Colton saw her in the doorway, exposed, vulnerable, a perfect target, and he broke cover. He stood up from behind the woodpile and roared at her, "Get down! Get inside!" The second gunman, bleeding from a gash on his forehead where the shattered shotgun stock had struck him, found his sidearm. He fired from the ground. The buckshot caught Colton in the left thigh and grazed his ribs. Colton grunted. His leg buckled. He went down to one knee, blood blooming bright red against the white snow. Clarabelle screamed. She raised the Navy revolver and fired at the man who had shot Colton. The bullet went wide by 3 feet, punching into a tree trunk. She had never fired at a living person before, and the difference between a pine cone and a human being was the width of the ocean. It was Colton, from the ground, teeth gritted against the agony in his shredded leg, who ended it. He rolled onto his side, jacked the Winchester one-handed, and put a round through the second gunman's shoulder. The man dropped his pistol and lay still, moaning. The clearing went quiet. Dutch Holloway sat on his horse, his revolver holstered, his hands visible. 2 of his men were down. He looked at the mountain man bleeding in the snow, and the red-haired woman standing in the doorway with a smoking gun, and an expression on her face that said she would empty every chamber in that revolver into anyone who moved. Dutch made a calculation. The kind of calculation that had kept him alive for 20 years in a profession where most men did not see 30. He raised his hands. "I am done," he said. Clarabelle kept the revolver pointed at his chest. She crossed the yard to where Colton lay, blood pooling in the snow beneath him. She knelt beside him, one hand on his chest, the other keeping the gun trained on Dutch. "He did not shoot me, Colton," she said. Her voice was shaking, but her hand was steady. "He lowered his gun when he saw me." Colton looked at Dutch through eyes glazed with pain. "Kill him," he rasped. "He will come back. He did not shoot me." "I do not kill a man who did not shoot me." "Clarabelle, he is dangerous." "So am I," she said, "and I am telling you. This is my call." There was a long silence. Colton looked at her. She looked at him. And something passed between them that was bigger than the argument about Dutch. She was claiming her ground. She was exercising the partnership they had agreed to. She was saying, "I have a voice, and you will hear it." Colton closed his eyes, nodded once. Clarabelle turned to Dutch. "Get off the horse, slowly." Dutch dismounted. "Graves owes you money, does he not? For the last job." Dutch narrowed his eyes. "He does." "Remember that," Clarabelle said. "There may come a day when someone else can pay better." Dutch studied her for a moment. Then he collected his wounded men, loaded them onto their horses, and rode down the mountain without looking back. Clarabelle dropped the revolver in the snow and turned to Colton. He was bleeding badly. The buckshot had torn up the muscle in his thigh and grazed 2 ribs. She hauled him inside, bolted the door, and went to work with Nollis herbs. Comfrey for the wounds, yarrow to slow the bleeding. She picked buckshot out of his leg with tweezers heated over the fire while he gripped a leather strap between his teeth and made no sound except a low, continuous growl that vibrated in his chest like a trapped animal. When she was finished and the wounds were bandaged and he was lying by the fire with his eyes closed and his face the color of old ash, Clarabelle sat beside him and said the words that she knew needed saying. "This is my fault. I went to town. They followed me back. I drew them here." Colton opened his eyes. He looked at her with an expression that held no blame, no accusation, only a hard, clear truth. "You made a choice. It went bad. That is frontier life. Do not let it break you. Learn from it." It was the first time he had spoken to her as an equal who could bear a hard truth without being destroyed by it. And despite the blood and the pain and the guilt coiling in her stomach, Clarabelle felt something settle inside her. Not peace. Not yet. But the knowledge that she was partnered with a man who would not coddle her, who respected her enough to tell her the truth about her own mistakes. That night, while washing blood from her hands in the creek, Clarabelle realized 2 things. 1, her monthly blood was 2 weeks late. 2, Graves would not send 3 men next time. He would send 30. Or worse, he would send lawyers. And on the frontier, paper could kill as surely as lead. The sound of paper tearing is like the sound of bone breaking. At least that is what Clarabelle thought as she opened Jed Calhoun's letter for the 3rd time by candlelight, looking for a version of the truth she could survive. April of 1884. The snow was melting fast now. Every morning the creek below the cabin ran louder and higher, swollen with snowmelt. Wildflowers were beginning to push up through the mud in the lower meadows. The world was thawing. But inside the cabin, a new kind of cold had settled. Clarabelle had not told Colton about the baby, not because she was afraid, not because she doubted him, because she was strategic. She knew Colton. She had lived with him for 5 months, and she understood the machinery of his mind. If he learned she was carrying his child, he would not wait. He would strap on his guns and ride down that mountain in his half-healed state, driven by a fury that was part paternal instinct and part guilt, and he would get himself killed. She needed him calm. She needed him whole. She needed time. But the secret weighed on her like a stone in her chest, and she needed help that Colton could not provide. She needed Nolly. She rode the mule down the mountain alone, not to Bannock, to Nala's camp in the high meadows to the east. The Shoshone woman was kneeling beside a small fire, boiling something that smelled of pine and mint, when Clarabelle arrived. Nali looked up, took one look at Clarabelle's face, and pointed to a flat rock beside the fire. "Sit." Clarabelle sat. Nali examined her with hands that were firm and knowing. She pressed fingers against Clarabelle's abdomen, felt along the curve that was just beginning to show beneath the loose fabric of her dress. She nodded. 4 months, maybe 5. Strong heartbeat. Clarabelle let out a breath she had been holding for weeks. Is it healthy? The child is fine. Are you eating? When I can. Some mornings the sickness is bad. Nali rummaged in her bag and produced a bundle of dried herbs, raspberry leaf tea. Drink it every morning. It will ease the sickness and strengthen the womb. She tied the bundle with a strip of leather and pressed it into Clarabelle's hands. Then she fixed Clarabelle with a look that cut through all the pleasantries and pretenses, the way a good skinning knife cuts through hide. 2 people keeping the same secret from each other is not protection. It is 2 people being alone together. Clarabelle stared at her. He knows? He suspects. He is not stupid. He sees you turning away from coffee. He sees your hand on your belly when you think he is not looking. But he will not ask because the last time a woman carried his child, she died. He is afraid that speaking it aloud will make it real. And real things can be lost. Clarabelle rode back toward Bannock with Nala's words echoing in her skull. She needed supplies, cloth for baby clothes, needles, more herbs. She also needed information. She needed to know what Graves was planning. She tied the mule outside the general store and went in with her head down and her shawl pulled forward. The store was nearly empty. Old Emmett behind the counter nodded at her without recognition. She gathered her supplies quickly and was heading for the door when a hand grabbed her arm. She spun, reaching for the knife on her belt, and found herself face to face with Jedediah Calhoun. He was a wreck, unshaven, red-eyed, stinking of cheap whiskey and guilt. He stared at her as though he were seeing a ghost. Oh, God, Mrs. McCrae. I thought you was dead. They said you burned up on the mountain. Let go of my arm, Mr. Calhoun, please." He pulled her into the alley behind the store, checking over his shoulder with the jittery paranoia of a man who has been looking over his shoulder for months. Words tumbled out of him in a flood. "I wrote this for you weeks ago. Could not find the nerve to send it." He thrust a crumpled, folded piece of paper into her hands. "Read it. You deserve to know." "God knows I should have told you months ago." Clarabelle leaned against the cold plank wall of the alley and opened the letter. It was scrawled in a shaking hand, nearly illegible, the paper spotted with what might have been tears or whiskey, or both. "Mrs. McCrae, I was there the night Patrick played his last hand. What Colton Ridge told you is true, but it is not complete. Ridge was at the table that night. He watched your husband bet you, and he did not say one word to stop it. He could have. He chose not to because he needed Graves to take the marker. He needed you in danger so he could step in and play the hero. I am sorry. I should have spoken sooner. Patrick was my friend, and I let him destroy himself, and I let Ridge use that destruction. God forgive me, Jed Calhoun." Clarabelle read the letter twice. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes did not blur. She felt strangely nothing at all, as though a door had opened inside her and everything had drained out at once, leaving a vast, echoing emptiness. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, looked at Jed, who was watching her with the tortured eyes of a man who has been carrying a burden too heavy for his bones. "Thank you, Mr. Calhoun. That took courage. Are you all right, ma'am?" "No, but I will be." She left the alley and untied her mule. She rode out of Bannock on the main road, and when she reached the fork in the trail, the place where the left path led to Helena and the right path led up to Dead Man's Peak, she stopped. She sat on the mule and looked down both trails. Left was freedom. Helena, a new city. She could sell the cabin deed, Start over, raise the child alone. She would be poor, she would struggle, but she would be free of Colton Ridge and his lies and his decade-long revenge plot, and his glacier blue eyes that saw too much and said too little. Right was the mountain. Right was the man who had used her, who had watched her husband sell her and done nothing because it served his plan, who had then spent 5 months sleeping on the floor and leaving flowers by her plate, and reading Eliza's letters with tears he would not shed, and teaching her to shoot and holding her in the dark like she was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. Clarabelle placed her hand on her stomach. The baby moved. A flutter, faint but unmistakable, like a bird trapped in a jar. She turned right, not because she forgave him, because she was furious, and she wanted to look him in the eye when he explained. She reached the cabin at dusk. Colton was sitting on the porch, his injured leg stretched out before him, the Winchester across his lap. He had been watching the trail, waiting. He saw her face and knew. She dismounted. She walked past him into the cabin. She set Jed's letter on the table and sat down. Colton followed her in. He saw the letter. He saw her expression. The expression of a woman who has been hit so many times that she has stopped feeling the blows and is now operating on something beyond pain, something cold and clear and absolutely merciless. "Tell me," she said, "all of it, every piece, and if you lie, even one word, I will walk down that mountain and you will never see your child." The word child detonated in the room like a stick of dynamite. Colton's eyes dropped to her belly. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Clarabelle waited. Colton told her everything. He had come to Bannock 3 years ago for one reason: graves. He had watched Patrick spiral into gambling and debt. He had not caused Patrick's addiction. Patrick was already drowning when Colton arrived. But Colton had not thrown a rope either. He had watched a weak man destroy himself because that destruction served Colton's purpose. The night of the poker game, Colton was at the table in the Gem Saloon. He saw Patrick, drunk and desperate, shove a marker across the felt and say the words that would haunt Clarabelle's nightmares for years. "If I lose, the winner gets my wife." Colton could have stopped it. He could have grabbed Patrick by the collar and hauled him out of that saloon. He chose not to, because he needed Graves to take the marker. He needed Graves to own Clarabelle so that Colton could buy her back and establish himself in Bannock without arousing Graves's suspicion. "I did not plan to care about you," Colton said. His voice was raw, scraped clean of all pretense. "You were a means to an end, a piece on a board. Then you stood in my kitchen and told me to use your name. Then you read Eliza's letters to me without flinching. Then you sang to me in the dark when you thought I was sleeping, and I—" He stopped. His voice broke. Not cracked. Broke. Like a bone. "You are not a means to anything. You are the only real thing I have touched in 10 years, and I know that does not fix what I did." Silence. The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the shutters. Somewhere outside, old Scar growled in the darkness, a distant sound like the mountain itself, clearing its throat. Clarabelle spoke. "You gambled with my life, same as Patrick. Different game, same table. Yes, but you are different from Patrick in one way. You are standing here telling me the truth. He never could." She stood. "I need 3 days. Do not touch me. Do not speak to me. If you respect me at all, give me this." Colton nodded. He picked up a blanket, went outside, and closed the door behind him. He spent the next 3 nights sleeping in the cold under the porch overhang without complaint. When it rained on the second night, he pulled the blanket over his head and did not come inside. Clarabelle heard the rain hammering the roof and almost opened the door. Almost. During those 3 days, she read Eliza's letters again. All of them. She read them the way a detective reads evidence, looking for the truth beneath the words. And she found the passage she needed. The one she had read aloud weeks ago without fully understanding its significance. "He is hard on the outside, but breakable underneath. He is terrified of love, because he is terrified of loss." If he ever does something foolish out of that fear, remember that fear is not the same as cruelty. Eliza, the dead woman, the first wife, speaking from the grave through ink on paper, providing the map that Clarabelle needed to navigate the interior of the man sitting in the rain outside her door. On the morning of the third day, Clarabelle opened the cabin door. Colton was sitting against the porch rail. He was soaked, shivering. His injured leg was stiff and swollen. He looked at her with eyes that expected nothing. She said, "I do not forgive you, not yet. Maybe not ever completely, but I choose to stay. Not because of the deal, not because of fear, because I believe you can become the man Eliza loved, and the child I am carrying deserves the chance to know that man." Colton wept. Not the dramatic sobbing of a stage play. Tears ran down his face, and he did not wipe them, as though he had forgotten how, as though the machinery of grief had rusted shut inside him and was now, after 10 years, cracking open. They did not embrace. They did not kiss. Clarabelle said only this, "Get up. Come inside. We have work to do. The men from Chicago will be here inside a month." She turned and walked into the cabin. She left the door open. And Colton Ridge, for the first time in his life, followed a woman through a doorway without needing a map to find his way home. Clarabelle McCrae did not know how to bring down a banker, but she knew how to read, she knew how to count, and she knew that men like Phineas Graves always left a trail of paper, because paper was how they forged their chains. May of 1884. The snow was gone. The mountain was green and fierce with wildflowers. Clarabelle was now visibly pregnant, 5 months along, her body changing in ways that were both terrifying and miraculous. But her mind was sharper than it had ever been. She had a plan, not dynamite, not guns, paper. For weeks she had been reading every scrap of documentation she could find. Colton's old mining claims, Patrick's IOUs that she had saved from the bank, and most critically, a stack of tattered newspapers that Colton had brought up from town months earlier, which she had been using as kindling until one headline caught her eye. It was a report from the territorial legislature in Helena about new regulations on lending practices, usury laws, interest rate caps, disclosure requirements for land forfeitures. Clarabelle read the article 3 times, then dug through the other newspapers for more. She found 2 additional articles. One described the Sherman Act and its implications for syndicate operations. The other detailed a case in Idaho Territory where a banker had been convicted of predatory lending and sentenced to 2 years in the territorial penitentiary. Clarabelle sat at the table surrounded by papers and felt something kindle in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder. Something with teeth. Graves' entire operation was built on lending practices that the territorial legislature had recently moved to regulate. The interest rates he charged, 40, 50, 60%, were criminal under the new statutes. The forfeiture clauses in his contracts violated territorial law. The pattern of systematic predatory lending, targeting minors and widows and anyone else too desperate to read the fine print, was exactly the kind of operation the legislature had drafted these new laws to destroy. The debt was real, but the terms were illegal. And if Clarabelle could prove it, every debt Graves held in Bannock was void. Every foreclosure was reversible. Every widow he had funneled into the Gem Saloon had been cheated, and the law, for once, was on their side. She needed allies. She could not do this alone. Clarabelle sent messages through Nolly, who moved freely between the mountain camps and the valleys without drawing attention. The Shoshone woman carried 3 letters sewn into the lining of her coat. The first letter went to Jed Calhoun. It was short. "Come to the Territorial Assayer's office on May the 15th. Bring your testimony about the poker game. Be sober." The second letter went to Sheriff Tom Buckner. It was even shorter. It asked a single question. "How much does Graves hold over you? And what would you give to be free of it?" The third letter went to Dutch Halloway, routed through intermediaries that Nolly knew in Virginia City. It was the most dangerous of the 3. It was a business proposition. Graves owes you money. I can pay what he will not. Name your price. Colton watched Clarabelle work. He sat at the table across from her while she sorted documents and drafted letters, and made lists of names and figures in her neat, precise handwriting. He watched her with an expression she had not seen before. Not assessment, not suspicion, not even admiration exactly. It was the expression of a man realizing that the person sitting across from him is smarter than he is, and deciding to be grateful for it rather than threatened. "You are better at this than I am," he said one evening. "I am better at this than most people," she replied without looking up. "My mother delivered half the babies in County Cork and kept books for everyone. Numbers do not lie." Colton looked at the stack of newspapers and the pile of legal documents and the map of Bannock that Clarabelle had drawn from memory with every business and property marked and annotated. "My plan was to walk into the bank with a gun and a stick of dynamite," he admitted. "I know it was," Clarabelle said. "That is why we are using my plan." He almost smiled. Almost. But the wound between them had not fully closed. They shared the bed, but there was distance, an invisible line down the center of the mattress. Some nights Colton reached for her and she let him. Other nights she turned away, and he accepted it without complaint. This was the cost of what he had done, and he paid it without protest, because he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that consequences are not punishments. They are simply the shape that truth takes when it has been denied too long. Buckner's response came first. The sheriff rode up the mountain alone on a Tuesday afternoon. No badge on his chest, no gun on his hip. He tied his horse to the hitching post and stood in the yard, looking like a man who had not slept in a month. Clarabelle met him on the porch. Colton stood behind her, leaning on a cane, his Winchester propped against the doorframe within easy reach. "Graves holds my family's ranch mortgage," Buckner said without preamble. "If I move against him, my wife and children lose their home. That is why I have done what I have done. That is why I have looked the other way. I am not proud of it. I am just telling you the reason." Clarabelle nodded. She did not judge him. She could not afford to. She needed him. "If Graves's lending is declared illegal," she said, "every mortgage he holds becomes void, including yours. Help me, and you free yourself." Buckner looked at her. He looked at Colton. He looked at the swell of Clarabelle's belly visible beneath her dress. He took off his hat. "What do you need?" "Your badge, your authority, and one honest day." Buckner stared at his hat for a long time. Then he put it back on his head and nodded. "Tell me when and where." "May the 15th. Bannock, the bank." That night, the pieces in place, Clarabelle lay in bed and felt the baby kick. Hard, insistent, impatient. "Easy," she whispered, her hand on her belly. "We are almost there." Beside her, Colton was awake. She could tell by his breathing. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," he said. "Of Graves?" "No, of after, of what happens when the fight is over and there is nothing left but this. He meant them. He meant the silence of the cabin and the weight of the past and the terrifying, defenseless act of simply being happy, of having something to lose again after 10 years of having nothing." "That is the hardest part," Clarabelle said. "I know. We will learn." She reached across the invisible line in the bed and took his hand. He held it like a drowning man holds a rope, and they lay there in the dark, two damaged people on a mountaintop, waiting for the dawn that would decide everything. Clarabelle McCrae did not throw dynamite through the bank window. She did something far more dangerous. She walked in through the front door and asked to see the books. Dawn. May the 15th, 1884. The sky above Bannock was the color of a fresh bruise streaked with red and gold. Clarabelle and Colton rode down the mountain together, side by side on the buckboard, the mules picking their way down the switchbacks, with the careful patience of animals that know every rock and root on the trail. Clarabelle wore a clean dress. Her red hair was braided tight against her head. Her face was calm. Her hands were steady on the reins. Colton wore his grizzly coat. His Navy revolvers sat on his hips. His cane was propped between his knees. He looked like exactly what he was, a mountain man who had come down from the clouds to settle a debt. They rode into Bannack on Main Street and the town stopped. Miners on their way to the shaft stood slack-jawed on the boardwalks. Shopkeepers froze in their doorways with brooms in their hands. Women pulled their children close and stared, because these two were supposed to be dead. The widow and the beast, burned alive on Dead Man's Peak, swallowed by the mountain, gone. But here they were, alive, together, riding down Main Street in the morning light like ghosts made flesh. Clarabelle pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the Beaverhead County Bank. She set the brake. She turned to Colton. "Stay here." Colton looked at her. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to go with her, to stand between her and whatever was waiting inside that bank. But this was her plan, her moment. He was the guarantee, not the weapon. "I will be right here," he said. "If you are not out in 15 minutes, I am coming in." "Fair enough." She climbed down from the wagon, smoothed her dress, and walked through the front door of the Beaverhead County Bank. Phineas Graves was sitting behind his mahogany desk, reviewing a ledger, when the door opened. He looked up. The color drained from his face so fast it was as though someone had pulled a plug at the base of his skull. Mrs. McCrae. Clarabelle sat down in the chair across from him, the same chair she had sat in 6 months ago, when he had offered her tea and a future of degradation. She did not sit on the edge this time. She sat back. She crossed her hands over the swell of her belly and looked at him the way a schoolteacher looks at a child who has been caught stealing from the jar. "I heard you had departed," Graves said, recovering his composure with visible effort. "I am hard to kill, Mr. Graves, like cockroaches and bad debt." She opened the leather satchel she had carried in and placed a folder on his desk. Inside were copies of every loan document she had been able to gather over the past 3 weeks. Jed Calhoun's "I Owe Us," Patrick McCrae's original debt agreement, Sheriff Buckner's mortgage, a dozen other documents collected from miners who had quietly passed their papers to Nolly during her visits to town, interest rates of 40%, 50, 60, forfeiture clauses that violated territorial statute, a pattern of systematic predatory lending stretching back 3 years. "I have sent copies of these documents to the governor's office in Helena by United States mail," Clarabelle said. 3 weeks ago. If I do not return safely from this meeting, a second set of copies will be delivered to the Helena Independent newspaper by a party whose name you do not know and whose location you cannot reach. Graves stared at the documents. His composure cracked, not because he feared guns or violence. Phineas Graves had survived 30 years on the frontier by being smarter and more ruthless than the men who relied on brute force. What he feared was exposure. If the Consolidated Syndicate in Chicago learned that their Bannack operation was under investigation, they would not send lawyers, they would send cleaners. And Graves knew exactly what cleaners did to liabilities. "You are bluffing," he said, but his hand was trembling. "Am I?" Clarabelle replied. "Count the documents, Mr. Graves, then tell me I am bluffing." Her eyes drifted to the desk. There, in a silver frame, was a daguerreotype of a young woman, pretty, with Graves's sharp features softened by youth. His daughter, the one studying at the seminary in Philadelphia. Graves saw Clarabelle looking at the photograph. For the first and only time in their acquaintance, Phineas Graves lost control. "Do not look at that." The words came out harsh and raw, stripped of all his practiced smoothness. In that flash, Clarabelle saw the truth. Graves was not evil for evil's sake. Every dirty dollar, every foreclosure, every widow pushed into the saloon, it all funded that girl's tuition, her future, her escape from the world that her father had created. It did not make Graves sympathetic, but it made him human. And humans were more dangerous than monsters because humans could convince themselves that anything was justified. Graves opened his desk drawer. Clarabelle saw the Derringer before he raised it, a small 2-shot pistol, the kind that bankers and gamblers kept for emergencies. He pointed it at her chest. "Paper burns, Mrs. McCrae. Starting with you." The back door of the bank opened. Dutch Halloway stepped in. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had entered rooms like this 100 times before. He crossed to Graves's desk in 4 strides and plucked the derringer from the banker's hand, the way a man plucks a thorn from his boot. "She is paying better than you, Phineas, and she pays on time." Dutch set the derringer on the desk, out of Graves's reach, and stepped back. His job was done. Clara Bell had paid him $500 in gold through Nolly. A professional transaction. No sentiment. No debts of honor. Just business. The front door opened. Sheriff Tom Buckner walked in. His badge was pinned to his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he was wearing it without shame. Behind him stood Jedediah Calhoun, sober, terrified, but standing. Jed's hands were shaking, but his jaw was set. He had come to tell the truth, and he was by God going to tell it. Buckner spoke the words he had rehearsed all morning. His voice was steady. His eyes did not waver. "Phineas Graves, by the authority vested in me as Sheriff of Beaverhead County, Montana Territory, I am placing you under arrest for usurious lending and violation of territorial statute, for arson of the Ridge Homestead on Dead Man's Peak, and for conspiracy to commit murder." Graves looked at Buckner. He looked at Dutch. He looked at Jed. He looked at the documents on his desk and the woman sitting across from him, with her hands folded over her pregnant belly and her green eyes burning with a fire that no amount of money or power or violence could extinguish. "My daughter," Graves said quietly. "She has nothing to do with this." Clara Bell looked at the daguerreotype one more time. She thought of Rosie Ridge, the little girl who never got to grow up. She thought of her own child, kicking inside her at that very moment. "Your daughter will not be harmed," Clara Bell said. "That is the difference between us, Mr. Graves. I do not punish children for the sins of their fathers." Buckner put the irons on Graves's wrists. He led the banker out of his own bank and into the bright morning sunlight of Main Street, where the people of Bannock had gathered in a silent, staring crowd. Graves would be transported to Deer Lodge, the territorial prison, to await trial. Territorial justice, territorial law. No one died in the Beaverhead County Bank that morning. No dynamite, no gunfight, no bodies in the street. The solution came from intelligence and alliance and civic courage, the weapons of a woman who knew that paper was stronger than powder and that the truth, once spoken aloud, could not be unburned. The miners and townspeople of Bannock watched Graves being led away. Some cheered, most were silent. It was the silence of people realizing that the system they had accepted, the debts they had paid, the indignities they had swallowed, were illegal. Had been illegal all along. That silence was more powerful than any cheer. Clara Bell stepped out of the bank into the sunlight. Colton was standing by the wagon where she had left him. His hands were clenched at his sides. His eyes were wet. "It is done," she said. "Not yet." He dropped to one knee. Right there on Main Street, in front of the entire town of Bannock, the beast of the mountain knelt in the dirt before the widow he had tried to use and ended up needing more than air. From his coat pocket, the pocket his hand had been drifting to for months, he pulled a ring, a simple gold band. Eliza's ring, the one he had carried for 10 years, the one he had sworn he would never give to another woman, Clara Bell McCrae. "I wrote the wrong contract. Let me write a new one, the right way." Clara Bell looked at the ring. She looked at the man kneeling before her. She looked at the town watching. She thought about everything that had happened since that November night when she had stood in a cemetery and spoken to a dead man. "Ask me again when we have a roof over our heads," she said. She took his hand and pulled him to his feet. They climbed onto the wagon together, side by side. She took the reins. He held the ring. The mules pulled them forward, and Bannock shrank behind them like a bad dream dissolving in the morning light. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She took his hand and pulled him to his feet, and they walked to the wagon together. And somewhere on the mountain above, old Scar raised his grizzled head, sniffed the warming wind, and went back to sleep. Clarabelle McCrae did not say yes to Colton Ridge's proposal on Main Street in Bannock. She said, "Ask me when we have a roof." It took him 4 months to build one. She made him wait every single day. 7 years later, 1891. The cabin on Dead Man's Peak had been rebuilt. Bigger, stronger, better than before. The scars of the old fire were gone, covered by fresh timber and creeping ivy that softened the hard edges of the logs. There was a porch now, wide enough for 2 chairs, and a view that stretched across the Beaverhead Valley to the distant Bitterroots. There was a proper chimney, stone laid by a mason from Bannock who owed the Ridges a favor he was glad to repay. There was a root cellar, a chicken coop, and a small barn where 2 milking cows and a bad-tempered mule lived in relative harmony. The cabin had not been built by Colton alone. After Graves's arrest and conviction, 2 years at Deer Lodge Territorial Prison for usury, arson, and conspiracy, the people of Bannock, whose debts had been voided, began to repay the mountain man and his wife in the only currency the frontier truly respected: labor and loyalty. Jed Calhoun led the building crew. He was sober now, had been for 6 years, and the steadiness of his hands when he swung a hammer was a daily miracle that he did not take for granted. Sheriff Buckner donated timber from his newly free and clear ranch. Nolly blessed the doorframe with sage and cedar in a quiet ceremony that Clarabelle attended barefoot, and Colton watched from a respectful distance with his hat in his hands. Graves did not survive his full sentence. Tuberculosis took him 18 months into his term. He died in a prison cot at Deer Lodge, coughing blood into a tin basin, with a letter from his daughter unopened on the pillow beside him. Clarabelle heard the news and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, just the flat, gray recognition that the world had taken its own revenge without requiring hers. The cabin had 2 bedrooms now, and on the wide windowsill in the main room, the sill where Eliza had once sat and watched the valley below, there were 2 small chairs, not matching, not store-bought, hand-carved by Colton during the long winters, sanded smooth and rubbed with beeswax until they gleamed. One chair belonged to Jacob. He was 6 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, quiet as a stone. He had his father's glacier eyes and his father's habit of watching everything and saying nothing. He could already track a deer through heavy brush and split kindling without being told. He was, in every way that mattered, a Ridge. The other chair belonged to Rosie. She was 4, red-haired, green-eyed, fierce as a wildcat. She had Clarabelle's temper and Clarabelle's stubbornness, and a laugh that could be heard from one end of the valley to the other. She asked why the way other children breathed, constantly and without rest. Not 2 sons, a son and a daughter. Clarabelle had named the girl Rosie. When she told Colton, he left the cabin without a word. He did not come back for an hour. When he returned, his eyes were red and his jaw was set, and he walked straight to Clarabelle and held her so tightly she could not breathe. He never explained. He did not need to. It was a summer morning. The meadow below the cabin was a riot of wildflowers, purple lupine and Indian paintbrush, and the white heads of beargrass nodding in the breeze. Clarabelle stood on the porch, wiping flour from her hands, watching her children. Jacob and Rosie were wrestling in the grass the way they wrestled every morning, with more enthusiasm than skill and more noise than either of them could account for. Jacob had the size advantage, but Rosie had the determination, and she tackled her older brother with a ferocity that would have concerned Clarabelle if she had not recognized it immediately as her own. "Easy, boys," a deep voice rumbled from the barn. Colton Ridge walked into the sunlight. He walked with a cane now. His left leg stiffened on cold mornings, the buckshot damage permanent, a reminder he carried in his body the way he carried everything else without complaint. But he was still a mountain of a man, still broad, still strong, still possessed of those pale blue eyes that could freeze a man at 50 yards or melt a woman's heart at 5. He carried a string of trout in one hand. He dropped them on the cleaning table outside the barn and watched his children with an expression that Clarabelle had not seen on his face until Jacob was born. A smile, genuine, unguarded, the kind of smile that cost him nothing because he was no longer keeping accounts. Colton was teaching Jacob to split kindling one afternoon when Rosie marched up and demanded to participate. "You are too small," Colton said. "Mama says nobody is too small for anything," Rosie fired back, hands on her hips, chin jutted forward in an exact replica of her mother's most formidable posture. Colton looked at Clarabelle, who was watching from the porch with a cup of tea and an expression of perfect innocence. She shrugged. Colton sighed. He picked up the small hatchet he had made for Jacob and handed it to his daughter. "Here, watch your brother. Do what he does, and for the love of everything holy, do not cut off your toes." Rosie beamed and swung the hatchet with enough force to embed it in the chopping block up to the handle. Colton looked at Clarabelle again. Clarabelle raised her teacup in a salute. "Your daughter," he said. "Yours too," she replied. But the scars remained. That was the truth of it, and Clarabelle would not pretend otherwise. Not everything was wildflowers and trout and children laughing in the grass. Colton still had nightmares, not every night, not even most nights, but enough. Once or twice a month, the war came back, or the fire came back, or both came back at once, and he would sit up in the dark, gasping and reaching for a weapon that was not there. When that happened, Clarabelle did not try to fix him. She could not. No one could. She simply put her hand on his chest and said, "I am here." And he would breathe, and the ghosts would retreat, and eventually he would sleep again. Clarabelle had her own ghosts. There were moments, sudden and unbidden, when a wave of anger would wash over her so fiercely that she had to sit down and grip the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. It took her a long time to realize that the anger was not about the present. It was about Patrick, a man who had been dead for 7 years. She was still furious with him for the lies, for the gambling, for the night he had pushed a marker across a poker table and sold her like a head of cattle. The wound had healed. But the scar pulled sometimes, especially on cold mornings, when the wind came down from the north and reminded her of that November day in the cemetery, when her life had ended and begun at the same time. That is what scars do. They remind you. And reminding is not the same as reopening. One afternoon, Clarabelle was cleaning a shelf in the bedroom when her fingers brushed something soft. She pulled it out. The cloth doll. The one she had found beneath the blanket on her first morning in the cabin. The one that had belonged to the first Rosie. She held it for a long time. Then she carried it into the main room where her daughter was sitting on the floor trying to teach the barn cat to shake hands. "Rosie." Clarabelle knelt beside her. "I have something for you." Rosie took the doll. She examined it with the serious, critical eye of a 4-year-old evaluating a new possession. Then she hugged it tight. "Whose is it, Mama?" Clarabelle looked up. Colton was standing in the doorway. He had come in from the barn and stopped there, frozen, watching his daughter hold the doll that his first daughter had held a lifetime ago. His eyes were bright. The muscle in his jaw worked. He nodded. Barely. Just a dip of the chin. Permission and gratitude and grief and joy all compressed into a single, almost invisible motion. "It belonged to someone very special," Clarabelle said. "Your sister." Rosie frowned. "I do not have a sister, you do. She has just been waiting for you to find her." Rosie considered this with the gravity of a territorial judge and then tucked the doll under her arm and returned to the cat. The cat was unimpressed by all of it. That evening, after the children were asleep, Colton and Clarabelle sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. The valley below was dark and quiet. Far off, at the place where the old cabin had stood before the fire, a pinpoint of light glowed. Someone had built a campfire there. New settlers, maybe. Drifters. The land did not care who lived on it. The land endured. "The contract expired a long time ago," Clarabelle said. "1 boy, 1 girl. Not the 2 sons you asked for." Colton leaned back in his chair. His cane was propped against the railing. His bad leg was stretched out in front of him the way it always was on cool evenings when the old wound ached. "You want me to rewrite it?" he asked. "No. I want you to tear it up." Colton reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. Yellowed. Creased. soft along the folds from years of being carried close to his body. The original contract, the one that Phineas Graves had drawn up in the bank that November night, the document that had bound a desperate widow to a haunted mountain man in exchange for gold and a promise. Colton held it up. He looked at it one last time. Then he tore it in half. The wind caught the pieces and carried them off the porch, spinning them out across the yard toward the creek. "So what holds us together now?" he asked. His voice was rough, the way it always got when he was feeling something too big for words. Clarabelle took his hand, the same hand that had killed men and skinned bears and trembled the first time it touched her face. She held it and looked at the mountains and the stars and the distant light on the valley floor. "The only thing that ever held anything," she said. "The choice to stay when the door is open." From inside the cabin, a small voice called out, "Papa." Rosie kicked off her blanket again. Colton sighed, the sigh of a man who has been called away from a moment he wanted to hold on to forever, but also the sigh of a man who has somewhere to go and someone calling him there. He stood, picked up his cane, and went inside. Clarabelle heard him murmuring to the children. His voice, the voice that had once growled ultimatums in a bank office and roared commands on a battlefield, was now soft as wool. "Rosie wants a story," he called from the bedroom. "Tell her one. She wants yours. How her mama tamed the bear." Clarabelle smiled. She looked at the mountains. She looked at the stars. She looked at the door of her cabin, the door she could walk through or walk away from every single day, and every single day she chose through. She stood. She brushed the dust from her skirt. She walked to the door and paused with her hand on the frame, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. The wood that Jed and Buckner and a dozen miners had raised. The door frame that Nolly had blessed with sage smoke and a prayer in a language older than any of them. From the high ridge above the cabin, a distant sound carried down through the darkness. A low, rumbling growl. Old Scar. Still out there. Still claiming his territory. Old and tired and scarred, but alive. Still alive. Clarabelle stepped inside. The door closed behind her. On Dead Man's Peak, the wind blew. The torn scraps of paper tumbled across the yard and settled into the creek, where the current caught them and carried them downstream. They dissolved in the cold mountain water, the ink bleeding away, the words disappearing, the contract returning to nothing. No one retrieved them. No one needed to. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.